You're listening to the Place Northwest podcast, your digital resource for the latest insight and analysis on all things property in the northwest of England.
Hello and welcome to this Place Northwest podcast. I'm your host, Dan Whelan. You are listening to the first of 4 episodes on the topic of co-living, sponsored by Oppidan Life. Since 2019, Oppidan Life has been operating Manchester's first co-living scheme on Swan Street in the Northern Quarter. The company offers flexible, all-inclusive living with bills, events and weekly food deliveries all included in the rent. Oppidan Life has plans to expand co-living, not just within Manchester and Salford, but across the UK and Europe. For more information about Oppidan Life, please visit oppidan-life.com. In this episode, we will explore the origins of this growing sector and take a look at its story so far. Along the way, we will learn about Oppidan Life, what it offers its customers, the lessons the company has learned following its first 2 years of operation, and what comes next. Joining me today are Colin Shenton, CEO of the Shenton Group, and Jackson Torchia, House Manager at Oppidan Life. Hello to you both.
Hi, Dan.
Hiya.
So we'll get into the questions. Colin, I'll ask you this one first. I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit of information about Oppidan Life, when it was founded, the reasons behind that, and any current schemes that you've got.
It was founded actually out of a different business. So back in 2015, we started a co-working business called Zifferblatt. And what was different about that was all-inclusive pricing, flexible contract, sometimes no contract at all. And when we opened the first Zifferblatt co-working space in the Northern Quarter in Manchester, it was instantly very popular. And somebody came up to me only a few weeks in and said, "This is amazing. When can I move in?" And I had to let them down gently and say, "Well, we're closing at 10 o'clock." But it did get the cogs to whirring about how we could produce something for not just office workers, but residents, tenants who would have something super flexible. So we came up with the concept back in 2016 to meet that demand, which was something that wasn't being done at all. Even in the UK at that point. I think the collective had only just started. So then we hunted around for a building. The Northern Quarter in Manchester is very friendly to new ideas and concepts. It's very welcoming of slightly off-the-wall ideas. So that was the right place to do it. And we settled on a building on the corner of Swan Street and Oldham Street and carried out that scheme. That went very well very quickly. And since then, we've identified a number of other larger schemes, mixture of conversion and new build, to take it forward.
Excellent. Yeah, I think a lot of people listening will be familiar with Zifferblatt and unlimited cake and coffee while you do your work, a very successful and popular concept. Jackson, I'll come to you. Tell us a little bit about the co-living concept in general and where it originated. I know a lot of people listening will be familiar with large schemes in Manchester that were approved last year, Downing in particular and Vita Group. But this is not a new concept, is it?
Yeah, well, that's actually why I love that question so much. People think this sort of sprung out of the ground very, very recently and has never existed before, but this is really just the latest iteration of it. The idea of communal shared spaces built around, a community that is not new at all. We've seen it time and time again. It's living 101 for human beings. It really is. It's the kind of oldest way to do it. So the modern concept of it, the way we sort of recognize it today, that is relatively new. It did start in Denmark and Berlin, but it did quickly spread to other areas. And it really came out of a response to a few different things. One being there's, a housing price rise in major cities all around the world. It's harder and harder to rent. The other is there is a rising social isolation, especially in the digital age that we're currently in. And there is just a bit of a value shift, with the rise of social media, and that people are valuing experience, and they want really great experiences, and they want really great memories, and that's all that live your best life sort of mentality that is just growing around the world. So those two things have really kind of helped the modern concept of co-living come about. And it did start quite recently in New York in 2015 and in London in 2016, the two big schemes that really capture the modern concept of it. And those modern concepts are pretty simple. It's flexibility and convenience and stress-free living, which is something rarer and rarer in the property market and the residential sector in cities. And it's about inciting connection and bonding and human relationships. And they do that through events and the spaces and a lot of different things, which I'm sure we'll get onto. But that is sort of the current concept of it. But its origins go back as literally as far as we do as humans. It goes all the way back, and it is nothing new. It's just a new way of doing it, and quite honestly, we're slowly perfecting it. Is where we're at currently, which is why I love that question so much. People are a little bit behind on exactly where the origins came from and exactly why we are where we are. It's quite a natural progression, really.
Excellent. That's really useful to get a bit of insight into the origins. You mentioned New York there, where it's growing. What about in this country? What are the prospects ahead for Manchester and the rest of the Northwest? Obviously, you guys are doing things, and Downing and Vita, as I mentioned before. Do you see this taking off?
I think there's no doubt it will. I think it's already, even with all the barriers that it currently has, it's so new and there's a lot of question marks about it and there's a lot of worry about it and it's still just exploding and it's still just everywhere. And I think it just comes down to there's clearly an appetite for it and there's clearly, a reason people are attracted to it. And like I said, those three big responses of, it's more and more difficult to rent. Social isolation is increasing, and people want these sorts of good high fast lifestyles that they can really enjoy. So the demand is really unquestionable, and that's why we're seeing these big schemes come up, and that's why we are so excited to be a part of these next big schemes. And yeah, Manchester's right on the doorstep now of joining New York and London and having these large scale co-living schemes. So it's a really interesting time to be a part of it here.
Excellent. Colin, Jackson mentioned social isolation there. Obviously, during the last 12 months, that issue has really come to the fore with various lockdowns and things like that. Do you see that being a driving force behind the co-living movement in the coming months and years?
I think it actually is, and without wanting to wish a pandemic on anybody else, it's been very interesting seeing how the sector's been affected by it. One of the things that we say often about why Oppidan is different from other people's co-living is that where very large schemes are proposed, they're almost, and this is true with Downing and Vita, student developers effectively doing a student-type scheme, but without the student occupier restriction. Proper co-living or true co-living in our mind is not a building of 3,000 or 4,000 people, but it's a small community of 15 to 20 people, and we achieve a large building by creating an individual community on each floor. So, for example, we're bringing forward a 20-story scheme in Salford, which is not one Oppidan, it's 20 Oppidans, one on each floor. And the reason that's been an interesting lesson during this last pandemic has been that the 15 people who are living in the current sort of toe in the water Oppidan that we did in the Northern Quarter have been regarded as a bubble. And you can have a bubble which is 15 people, and they can co-work and they can co-live and they can socialize, and they don't feel as isolated as somebody who, if they were living in what's effectively a student building, will find, and it's true with BTR as well, that all of their social amenity spaces are closed off. So you just get to have your room or your apartment, which is probably not shared with anybody because 70% of city centre apartments are single occupiers. But if you go to one of the big BTR schemes right now in March, you'll find that all of the social spaces and the gyms and the spas are closed for COVID reasons. For a single story, self-contained Oppidan of 12 to 20 people, let's say, that wouldn't happen. You can move around your Oppidan, you can use the shared spaces. And so, as I say, not wishing any kind of pandemic to return to us, if God forbid anything ever happened like that again, or there's a third or fourth wave of COVID-19, then the Oppidan model is well prepared for it.
Absolutely. And Jackson, maybe you could give us a little virtual tour around one of the Oppidan Life floors. Imagine you're taking us around there. What can we expect to see, and what amenities does Oppidan offer to its residents?
Yeah, of course. Again, this is something we've put a lot of thought into. There's a lot of history here that, information we've learned through our experience. about how that should feel, exactly about how that should feel if you're walking into it and seeing it for the first time. It's harder to paint a picture just with words, but I will do my best. And the idea is quite simple with the design, in that people want that sense of privacy when they go into their own spaces, and they need that sense of privacy in their own living rooms. And so there needs to really feel like a natural divide between the shared spaces they have with everybody else and their own. So walking through an Oppidan, actually, the first access you have is, take a left and you can reach the shared spaces. And these are quite domestic spaces, and they're supposed to be. They're supposed to feel very homely. So it's large dining and kitchens where you can cook and eat together and have events and basically socialize and do that sort of homely lifestyle. It's also things like a very comfortable living room and TV room. It's a big part of life at the moment is to sit down on that couch and watch, put a game on, put a movie on, put Netflix on. It's a huge part of it. And the other element we sort of always usually introduce is the sort of study quieter room. For things like being able to read in there, being able to play games in there, being in smaller intimate groups. And we've kind of chosen these layouts very deliberately, because they're supposed to feel very, very domestic and very homely and give you that sense of comfort. And it's from experience, because if you walk into a large event style room that's just free for you to use, it is actually quite intimidating for you to then go and make yourself at home and just take it over. It needs to feel familiar for people, so we've designed it that way. And then there's a separation, so you come out of those spaces, and you take a whole other turn, and that's when you can approach the private spaces, and the private rooms will branch off from there. And you are able to step away if you need to. That very deliberate design of having your private space, go up to your private studio and have your time is essential. It's really important. So we have designed it that way, and that is how it feels to walk through an Oppidan, where you've got sort of like the red pill, blue pill. Are you going to jump into it and go into the social spaces, or do you need your own time? Are you going to be working in your own space and go in the opposite direction? And this is all things we've picked up from direct experience from talking to the people that use these spaces and live in these spaces every single day, and what they need to feel at home there.
Absolutely. Colin, perhaps you could talk about some of the misconceptions around co-living. We mentioned before the Downing and Vita schemes. There was quite a lot of opposition from residents when they were going through the planning process. I think a lot of the objections were perhaps based on, I don't want to say ignorance, but a lack of understanding of what the sector actually is. How is Oppidan overcoming and rewriting those misconceptions?
I think developers have two problems. One is that you ask 10 developers what their co-living building contains, and you might get 10 different answers. So there's no consistency of what co-living is defined to be. And I think the second problem developers have is they very often don't put as much thought as you might think into how buildings are going to operate after they've built and sold them. Very often it's a question of what can I get planning for, what will make me the most money, I'm then going to sell them, and I'm out. The difference with Oppidan is that we're investors as well as developers. We'll own these buildings in 5, 10, and 20 years from now. So we care very much about not only the obvious stuff like what's it going to cost to run, but we get our greatest investment return by having consistent demand for the apartments. So we want people to be happy living there, and we want them to renew their leases. And for that reason, it's a better investment for us. So the key thing the developers need to do, and this is one of the reasons why we're asking quite loudly for some regulation. Might sound unusual for a developer to ask to be regulated, but we know what a normal apartment looks like. We know what a serviced apartment looks like. We know what an HMO looks like. We know what a hotel looks like. But at this stage, we don't quite know what co-living is. So I read an article just yesterday where it referred to them as flat shares. I've seen them regarded as effectively hotels. It could be anything. And so we're taking a slightly different view because we think that we understand how people are going to use these spaces. So the first thing we have to do is design them and build them to a high standard. And thereafter, we have to manage them, if you like, to a high standard. And that's really what makes it different between what Oppidan is offering and what other developers are offering, because we're not just the developer, we're the investor, and we're interested in the operation of the building. and that's about creating the brand. And also, as Oppidan is part of Shenton Group, our background is residential development. It's not student development. So we're not a student developer just looking for ways of renting out our spaces to a wider audience. We're coming at it from the other side, which is we do luxury apartments. How do we make them more affordable?
Absolutely. You're coming at it from a different angle, which is obviously going to result in a different product. Jackson, Colin mentioned leases there. What sort of leases do you offer Oppidan residents?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big part of the co-living flexibility and convenience angle, in that we do very, very, very flexible contracts. And, the idea is, we do as short as 2 weeks to anywhere up to years. And we want to give people that option, and people really, really want to take that option, especially with something very new. It's, co-living is still, there's question marks in people's minds about it. And really flexible contracts is one of the first sort of big barriers that we remove, that we do differently from other residential areas. And that is saying, look, you tell us, what's going to work for you in your co-living, adventure. How long do you want to stay for? Are you interested in trialing? Are you interested in going all in and signing up long term? It's the ball's in your court, not ours, and we're happy to work with you in that regard. And it is really like that. That's one of the first steps in, and it's one of the first barriers down, and it makes a big difference with what co-living does to provide that flexibility. But it just keeps sort of snowballing from there. We do quite flexible payment options for people. We do very, very low deposits. We do 1 week deposits. That's another major barrier to renting that the co-living industry doesn't need. It doesn't need to be like that. Um, so slowly but surely we sort of remove these barriers. We're trying to be really flexible. We're trying to be very, very welcoming for people. And that stress-free element, it's really important, because we want people to put their energy into other things. We want people to put their energy into making the community a great place to be a part of and be involved in, for the building to be a really fun environment. That's where they can put their energy. We'll handle the rest. And that's, again, like as Colin said, that idea of that operation element. This is where co-living is currently unrivaled. It offers such a high level of customer service and such a high level of user experience and user focus on how people are actually feeling and enjoying it, and what do they need, and how do we get them to have to get the best out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Almost a try before you buy element, 2 weeks to see what you think. But obviously your hope is that they'll fall in love with the concept and stay for longer. I think giving people that flexibility is really important. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the type of people who would be attracted to this concept. What kind of person does co-living appeal to? Jackson, maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll kick us off for sure. And you know, we get this a lot, and it's a misconception, but the reality is it is not age based; it's lifestyle based. And it does naturally lead towards a younger age group, because that lifestyle is slightly more common in the younger age group. And the lifestyle we're talking about really is just wanting to be able to meet new people regularly and live, a bit more of a social life, a bit more of an active life. And this lifestyle, it's everywhere, and it's not defined by an age bracket. A lot of people that don't really understand co-living, I feel like they've reached a point in their lives where they're no longer looking for those sorts of things, which is not a problem at all. It's wonderful, actually, but life can throw a lot of curveballs at people a lot of the time. And what we find is people re-enter this lifestyle at all different points in their lives. People that may be going through divorces, or maybe going through big career changes, and they find themselves wanting to be around, wanting to be able to network and be around that, co-working, co-living crowd again, to help speed track this new career. Like, all sorts of reasons people return to this lifestyle, and people appeal to our demographic again. So we've had people as young as 19 in our building, as old as 79. We had a 79-year-old retired gentleman, again, because that lifestyle is not age based. It is, the appeal for people for that lifestyle is connection, and it's universal, and I think everyone can relate to it, and it can come at you at any point in your life.
And Colin, something you said where we had a chat before this podcast, which basically sums up what Jackson just said, and it was you're attracting people with a particular outlook rather than people of a particular age.
Yes, and it's been really interesting actually watching the first building fill up very quickly and the nature of the people who did so. So we originally assumed it would be post grad 22 to 35, probably local already in the city. Not true. Something like more than 50% of the people in the building were foreign nationals, were from abroad. Not all of them international students, as you might expect, but a huge range. I think at one point we had 7 different countries, 5 different first languages, lots of people, improving their English on a daily basis, um, and all looking for a way in which they could come to a new city and use co-living as a gateway to learning the city. So, as Jackson says, one of the great things about being super flexible with the length of the tenancy, and we do 2 weeks and upwards, so we're not competing with hotels and service departments. We want people to stay and make a contribution to the community. But if you were arriving fresh from Tokyo, as one of our tenants did, with not the best English in the world, although a damn sight better than my Japanese. It's a way in which people can plug into a city, and this was pre-COVID. And you say, okay, where are the concerts? Where are the gigs? Where are the theatres? How do I find a dentist? How do I find a doctor? How do I rent a car? All of this kind of stuff is very, very difficult. If I moved straight to Tokyo and on my own, I wouldn't know where to start. So why do we assume that people coming in the other direction know where to start? So it gives you this great resource and this structure upon which you can build the kind of life that you want. And we do sort of say that our job is to resource our tenants, is not to tell them how they're going to live or how they're going to experience a city. So we give them the background and we give them the tools, and they can make from it whatever they like, take as much from it, put as much into it as they want to do. And so that flexibility in terms of their contribution, if you like, is just as important as us being flexible, trying to attract people.
Absolutely. I wonder as well, consultation in terms of the planning system becoming more and more important, especially when things are going virtual like they have done in the last year. This concept of co-living is new and people don't know a great deal about it, although hopefully they will know more after listening to this podcast. How do you convince communities and residents that setting up an Oppidan Life co-living block is going to benefit them? How do you have that conversation and how do you get your point across, Colin?
Oppidan Life could do it because, thanks to permitted development rights a few years ago, we were able to create the first scheme in Manchester. So we can take Manchester's planners and councillors to the building. They can see something which exists. They can meet and talk to the tenants, and they can see what the actual experience is. I think beyond that, first of all, no other developer can do that in Manchester. That's uniquely us. But beyond that, it's a matter of probably doing what the city planners are doing, which is just taking baby steps and saying, okay, let's allow a certain amount of this, see how this goes. If it works, then we'll release a little bit more and we'll go further. So they've concentrated on a very small number, less than a handful, of very large schemes. They've been saying in Manchester that they'd sort of like to allow 5,000 units and see how it goes. The problem, as I see it, is that they've probably got 3 or more thousand of those 5,000 in 2 schemes. And that's too many eggs in one basket. So there needs to be a larger number of smaller schemes, and a larger number needs more developers. Because if you've got 2 developers each doing one massive scheme, and that's 60 or 70% of your supply, that's not going to be representative of what the whole market can produce. And the city's opinion of the sector will then be entirely dependent upon how those 2 developers perform. And of course, Manchester is full of very capable residential property developers. Not all of them with operational experiences like we happen to have, but everybody's willing to learn. So I think the city should have a larger number of smaller schemes, dot them all over the city, not necessarily in regeneration areas, and look at some form of regulation, even if that's through the planning system, through the use classes order, and define exactly what a co-living building is. And then people either meet the criteria or they don't. And if they do, then you're bringing something forward. The second thing that will apply is that we believe that co-living is where residential development and hospitality combine to the benefit of the tenant and also to the benefit of the operator because they're managing the buildings in a much more active way, in the same way that a hotel would. Now, if I brought you a development in the middle of Manchester and said that Marriott or Hilton or Premier Inn are attached to it, you'd know exactly what that brand was bringing. And the city then can find it very easy to accept or reject that development proposal. Whereas at the moment, other than possibly the Collective in the UK and Common in the United States, there are hardly any co living operating brands, which is a separate thing from an owning brand. Now, as Oppidan, we do everything because we like to keep everything under our control, and we're control freaks in that sense. But that's because we want to know that we've got power over what we're delivering to our tenants, and that it can be actually delivered and not promised by somebody else. But I suspect the way the market will go is akin to hotel, where one person owns the building and another person operates it. You'll know that Hilton have tens of thousands of hotels, but they own almost none of them. And the same is true with Marriott and Accor and all the rest of it. They operate an asset light management strategy where pension funds and other investors own the buildings and they manage them on behalf of. And the strength is all in the brand. So we could, as Shenton Group, have gone around building lots of co-living buildings and that'd be the end of it. But we think that the strength for us is having the Oppidan Life brand, which over time will start to mean something to people, and they'll choose to stay in an Oppidan building in the same way as you might choose to stay in a Marriott or a Sofitel or a Four Seasons hotel, because the brand is delivering. And I suspect what the city has to do, and it's not true of Manchester, it's true of the whole country, is sort of come to terms with how that sector is going to develop in terms of the regulatory offer and the quality of the brands which are going to come in to operate these businesses. And that's why people are a little bit nervous about it, because it's where BTR was 8 or 10 years ago. But come back in 2030 and you will see a very established, very substantial and very successful sector, which is at ease with the planning system and also with institutional investors.
Brilliant, really good insight into the sector. Jackson, I'll ask you this next question because it is about you directly. So your job role is house manager. What does that entail and how does that feed into the brand of Oppidan Life that Colin was talking about and the building of that brand?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I see it as it's that the second pier of the really important two pillars of what co-living is. The first being that it has to be designed really well and really intelligently, but if it's not operated properly, a building can be as great, as amazingly designed as it gets, but if it's not operated properly to that standard that a co-living needs, then it's not a co-living building. And the whole point of the house manager is that customer service and that user experience aspect of it. It is a huge part of what makes building enjoyable for people and what brings down those, the barriers that a lot of other residential sectors have. So my role it's a lot of different hats all in one place. It's about bringing people into the building, so introducing them to co-living. So there's that, you know, um, there's that real education piece of you know this is what the building is, and I can show you it and I can explain it to you, and I can try to really impart what it's all about, and find out whether or not people the person interested is going to be able to contribute to that and really wants to be a part of it. But once they're through the door, I'm still very much heavily involved in the day-to-day life of that building, and it's a lot to do with being able to give the community and help, basically, give the community the tools they need and the resources they need and the help they need to make the community exactly what they want it to be, and to make their experience there exactly what they want to have there. So it's all really about empowering them. So I help with all the on-site events that go on, to offer free events to the tenants, and a lot of that comes from directly, what do they want, to experience, and what do they want to see, and I facilitate that. I'm also, heavily involved in the member relations side of things. Keeping the community engaged with one another on our online platforms. So our strongest one at the moment is a WhatsApp group, but the change compared to on what building you're in. But it's keeping that active and keeping people engaged and keeping people contributing. It's basically being able to sit there and say, you're part of co-living, and co-living is about what you guys make it. And to do that really well, I'm here to help. I'm here to facilitate, encourage, support, and to basically help you build this community. Because without them, without the people there, and without them contributing and getting involved, it's not a co-living. It's not really a community. And that sense of I help build this, and I'm helping create it, and I am an active part of it. That is what the true feeling of that connection comes from. That is what true, sense of that you've gained something from co-living. That's where it comes from. Those that contribute, those that give the most to it, end up taking the most away from it, and end up coming away with the best experience of it. And that's why operation is so important, and that's why that customer service element is so very important. Because if you can't help them contribute to it, they're not going to experience everything it has to offer. They're not going to experience to the level that, to its full potential. And that's part of my job. And I'm very lucky that I get to do this. It's a really interesting role, and it's quite a new sort of area to be involved in. And every day is a new adventure.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds great. But yeah, supporting the tenants with that transition into co-living, as it's a new concept, is quite important, I think. Drawing to a close as we're running out of time, Colin, I want to ask you about the plan going forward, and also what you've learned in the first 2 years of running Oppidan Life. What are the main lessons you've learned, and what can we expect from Oppidan Life over the next 5 years?
Wow, that's a big question. I think the great thing about the first 2 years has been that it's confirmed something that we hoped would be true, which is that co-living is the biggest untapped sector in the residential market. And the residential market needs all the help it can get to provide a larger number of more affordable, preferably city centre, by which I mean brownfield development sites. And so this is something which is going to grow massively. It's a lot of fun, and it also has a lot of property development. Frankly, is quite dry. Construction is quite difficult and can be a bit boring. And so to come up with a concept which is fun and which is genuinely sociable and which has a very clear role in bringing people together. After a year of lockdown, the one thing we know for certain is that people need people. And if we can produce a building or a series of buildings which are operationally excellent, are built to the highest architectural standards, are happy and exciting places to live, then I think what we've learned over the last 2 years is that people don't just want that, they need that. They need it in city centres. And what we're going to aim to do over the next 5, even 10 years is build one or two larger buildings, sort of 200, 300, 400 units in each of the top 8 cities. So our intention is to build 15 Oppidans over the next 10 years. But I can tell you that they will not be 2,000 units a time, because I don't have 2,000 friends and I don't have time to make 2,000 friends. And I could probably make 20 friends. So within those 15 buildings, there might be 300 or 400 Oppidans. And within the 400 Oppidans, there might be 8,000 units. But it's done in a very granular way. So we believe that Oppidan Life is the true definition of co-living. The co in co-living is community, and we build small, sustainable communities in equally sustainable city centre locations.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Colin. A brilliant introduction into this 4-part series, learning a little bit more about the sector, the origins of it, and basically getting up to speed with what it is. It's been really interesting speaking to you both, and hopefully for those listening, you've enjoyed it and you'll join us again for the next one. For now, Jackson, Colin, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
If you would like to learn more about Oppidan Life, please visit oppidan-life.com.